Hey folks, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to talk about the money monsters for each of the 9 Enneagram types. So if you don't know your type, you can watch the previous video, or there's a great test you can take on my website. You can find the link. It's called the IVQ9, which I highly recommend. You can go to douglam.com to find out, to get links to that test. But let's jump into it. So what I've done with the Enneagram is I've layered on top of it what I call the attachment theory of money. So for those of you who are familiar with the attachment theory of relationships, it's basically the same thing, just applied to the world of money. So what is the attachment theory of money? Well, it comes down to 2 key points, which is that when we have an unhealthy relationship to money, we can either be anxiously attached to it, meaning we're kind of white-knuckling our financial life and driving with a little bit of road rage, and we kind of throw down if we get charged $10 for a bottle of water at the airport, or something dents our financial plan, or we're always scrambling to make more and can never seem to be content with what we have. So that's sort of the anxious type. They're living in constant anxiety and fear of not having enough or their money running out. And some of that fear can be very legitimate if you're broke, but for people who are wealthy, it can actually become an obsession and can become a real problem, and it can harm their personal relationships, their career, and their work-life balance. And then on the opposite side, we have the folks who are money avoidant, like myself, which hopefully I've been working on that for many years and have overcome it. And I'm going to give you the tricks for overcoming any of your money monsters in the series of videos, and especially in my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, which is now available on Amazon for pre-order. But the avoidant money type, what their problem is that they out of fear or they tend to push money away, or they procrastinate on paying their bills, or they stay in underpaying jobs, or don't level up their skill set. They're fundamentally scared. The anger, the fear, the sadness that money brings up for them repels them. And so they push back and they resist really engaging with their financial life in a healthy way. Or they avoid becoming financially literate. And that's one of the big things that holds most of us back from a robust financial life, is we don't know the language of finance. And so it's all kind of an enduring mystery, because we never kind of get off our butts and are willing to overcome that avoidance of money to learn the basic skills necessary in order to have a really successful and robust financial life. And then, of course, there's the possibility of what I call the jumbled style, which is we can mix and match. We can be anxious about money in one area of our life, and we can be avoidant about it in another. And we can flip back and forth between anxious and avoidant depending on the time of day or our mood. So most of us are jumbled. And there's really 4 key areas, that what I call the 4 pillars of finance, which is earning, saving, investing, and giving. So you want to think about all 4 pillars of your financial life and think about, am I anxious in one area? Am I an anxious earner? But am I an overspender, meaning I avoid savings? Or some of us are great at earning and saving, but we avoid giving. We never really give back to our communities or do things for others. And so that's a real lack in some folks. So where do you land in earning, saving, investing, and giving in your financial life? Now let's walk through the different money monsters for each of the 9 Enneagram types. And since there's 2 choices, being really anxious or avoidant, there's 2 money monsters then for each of the 9 Enneagram types. And let me walk you through them right now. Now we'll start with the anger triad. We'll start with the 8 for no apparent reason. It's just we'll start anywhere we want. But if you remember from the last series of videos, 8s have this what we call this externalized anger. They're always pushing against the boundaries of limitations around them. And that can lead to the 2 money monsters, what I call the Detonator and the Dominator. So the Detonator is an 8 who's avoidant around money. Now, 8s tend not to be so much avoidant about money itself, but about the limitations that it can put upon them. So the avoidant 8 they engage with their money, but they tend to detonate prudent financial limitations, like a good budget, or they might go out to dinner and they want to pick up the tab to show everyone who's the boss. And they always want to use money for control and empowerment. So that's true of all the 3 types in the anger triad. They're looking for control and empowerment from money, even when they're avoiding it for the 8, when they're blowing up and detonating their budget, or detonating their spending plans, or they're just sort of really using money to control their environment, even if it means going into debt or not paying off their bills. They just don't want to deal with all the constraints that financial limitations put on them. And then on the other side, they can be what I call a dominator. So the dominator is someone who's going to use money to really weaponize money and use it to dominate others and control them and control their financial lives. I had a client like this, and he had a lot of money, and so he used it to control his children, making them dance like puppets on his strings, do this, do that, or you're not going to get any money. And so what that did is it bred a lot of resentment and anger in his kids, and they were just kind of, sadly, kind of waiting for him to pass so they could inherit his money and do what they want. So the dominator often gets compliance on a surface level through money, but they really breed a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a lot of frustration in the people around them when they do that. So those are the two quick, I'll do a complete video on each of the 9 types. We'll go do one separate video for all 9 types about their money monsters, but this is just a quick overview, right? So then we move into type 9, which is the peacemaker, and they have this both internalized and externalized anger, meaning that they hate conflict. So they hate the conflict and the pain and the anxiety that money problems bring about. So there's really, they can be, I call them the Spud or the Dud. So the Spud is the classic couch potato, someone who just never gets off their butt and really gets their act together. They're so afraid of the conflict or the as I said, the grittiness essentially that really engaging with their finances will take, and all the emotional turmoil that it might bring up. So they're just kind of sitting on the couch, kind of like a sloth, never really sitting in park and never getting anything done. And then if they're anxious about money, so 9s when they're unhealthy. We all can be very healthy in our types. We're just talking about the negative side here. But I call them the dud, meaning they kind of have this flurry of activity. You can see them running around doing a lot, but they're not really willing to risk the fight that's necessary or the conflict that's necessary to really resolve their financial issues. So everything they do kind of tends to be a dud. And that's the 2 types for the 9. And in a weird way, again, it gives them a sense of control. They control their problems by not dealing with them, essentially, which then they just build up, and that creates more suffering for them down the road. So that's not a good strategy. And then if we move to the type 1, the improver, they have this internalized anger at themselves when things aren't done right or perfect. So they can be highly perfectionistic, and they can have a lot of resentment and frustration when kind of always wondering why the people around them can't get their act together. So when they're avoidant, I call them the prude. Now, since the 1 needs to be perfect and morally upright, and they have this really strong inner critic that they don't want to trigger, they don't want to trigger their anger. And since if a 1 is financially illiterate and they don't really understand the world of finance, they don't want to feel bad about their lack of financial acumen. So they do this kind of weird twist in moral logic, and they make dealing with money bad instead. So they can be very prudish about finances and very judgmental of people who might have a more robust financial life or people who really care about money. So they push money away out of sort of this moral purity, and they think that money is bad, capitalism is all bad. I mean, capitalism has its problems, don't get me wrong. Externalities are a real issue, but nonetheless, it's sort of the best of the bad systems that we have. And so they sort of demonize financial markets, financial systems, and so their financial life is really quite, they don't really get anywhere. And then on the other hand, I have what I call the pious. They're the very anxious type 1. They're very perfectionistic. Their budget is always in order. Every I is dotted, every T is crossed, every penny is tracked. And the pious can have a really good financial, they can find security, but the problem is that then they kind of breed resentment and anger and frustration in the people around them because they're so controlling that it really gets in the way from them enjoying their life, enjoying their money, connecting with others. So they become very rigid and controlling around their financial life. And then if we move into the sadness triad, now people like myself, I'm a type 3, as some of you know, they're always seeking validation and connection through everything they do and through their money. And if you're a type 2, the helper, they have this externalized sadness. They feel sad or shamed about how they think other people perceive them. And when they're money avoidant, I call them the bleeder, meaning they bleed out. They're sort of like a hemophiliac with a paper cut fetish. They're just always giving their money away. They're so generous to a fault that it really drains their own financial life. They don't really ever get things together because they feel guilty about doing something for themselves and taking care of their own finances, that they're going to bleed out their resources in service to others, because they're looking to use their money for validation, to feel loved. Like, love me, validate me, tell me I'm worthy. And they're going to use gifts and acts of service and their financial resources to do that, at times much to their own personal detriment. And then on the other side, if you're at the two's anxious about money, I call them the bonder, meaning they're giving with and this is we all have our shadow side, and the shadow side of the two is that they're giving to get. They're giving it compliments, they're giving you acts of service and kindness so that you will reciprocate and turn around and tell them that they're wonderful, give them the love, give them the care that they're really looking for. But the bonder is sort of like the person, there's that parable. It's better to teach a person to fish than to give them a fish every day. And the bonder to the anxious one is someone who's likely to give a person a fish every single day rather than to teach them to fish, because they're sort of addicted to the gratitude that their gifts their generosity produces. So they can sort of essentially, in a way, kind of create this indentured servitude in the people around them, bonding them to them out of a sense of using the acts of service and the gratitude to really kind of trap people in the orbit of the two, and it's really hard to get out of that orbit once you become financially dependent on the money anxious too. And then if we move into the type 3, the achiever, they have both an internalized and externalized sadness, or you call it shame, or a sense of grief around their identity, which creates their fundamental fear of being worthless. So money becomes a way to assuage that sense of worthlessness. But unfortunately, when a 3 is avoidant around money, I call them the barrier. Meaning like the ostrich who buries their head in the sand and doesn't want to look at it. They don't want to deal with money because it brings up that sense of worthlessness and that shame inside them, because their financial life is kind of in shambles. And so they push their financial responsibilities away. And so the barrier is someone, it's a tough one. And I've been there. I can attest to the problems that brings out. And then or maybe to put it more succinctly, that the sense of self-worth for a 3 is really lacking. And so they judge their bank balance, their net worth and their self-worth become kind of inextricably linked. And since their net worth isn't very high, then looking at that triggers their lack of self-worth, and they don't want to deal with it, so they bury their head in the sand, and then their financial life gets worse, and then things fall apart. On the flip side, we've got the Blinger, which is maybe a bit more common in 3s, someone who is really anxious about money, and they always sort of bling out their life. So they may earn a lot, but it's all going to status symbols, the nice car, the nice house, the nice watch, the nice clothes, whatever it is that's going to make them feel worthy in the eyes of others. And so it's a way to sort of win validation and connection by saying, look at me, look how wonderful I am, look at all the wonderful things I have, and basically look how much better I am than you because of all the cool stuff I have. And that really can decimate your financial life, because if you spend everything you have on stuff, then you're not going to have any money left to invest, to give, and to really build up that robust financial life that we all need to have. And now moving to the 4, the individualist. The 4 has this deep internalized sadness or shame and grief about how they perceive themselves. So they're always trying to stand out and stand apart. And so they're using money as a way to feel different and special and unique from everybody else. But if they're avoidant around money, which is very common in 4s, I call them the flop, meaning it's sort of like you can hear them sort of face planting on the pavement in their financial life. They just sort of flop. It's just like they don't want to follow the rules of convention. So they don't want to have a budget. They don't want to deal with often what they feel to be the capitalistic system. They don't want to deal with whatever. They don't want to do what everybody else is doing. And sometimes that can pay off in very creative ways, but financially it tends to decimate their financial life because they never really get their act together. They reject all the prudent practices that one would do because they're too conventional to build up their financial life, so everything tends to be a bit of a mess. And then on the flip side, we've got the Flinger. So the Flinger 4 is one who is anxious about money, but they're using it to basically stand apart and say, it's kind of look at me, look how much better I am because I've got this stuff. But they tend to take their money and fling it at any form of creativity and self-expression. So they can throw their money away on their art projects, their music, anything that makes them feel special and unique. There's an old saying, I think the Flinger 4 is the one who lives out the truism that you can't take it with you, but you can sure wear it out the door. So you often see 4s who are flingers peacocking with some sartorial splendor because they want to stand out and stand apart. And there's almost no amount of money that an unhealthy 4 will fling at anything that will allow them to feel special and unique, and that can create all kinds of problems in their financial life. All right, moving on to the 5, we're into the fear triad, and the fear triad is looking for security and certainty in the world. And the 5 uses money. The investigator, they have this internalized fear about not being competent or being able to manage life in reality, so they kind of pull back from and call them the observer. They're very reserved, or I call them the compact car. But when they're money avoidant, I call them the Moot, meaning money for them is irrelevant. They would rather live in their head. They want to live in the world of ideas. They don't want to engage with the material world in a meaningful way. And so they're avoiding money by basically just saying it's irrelevant. They'll live a very minimalistic lifestyle. They tend not to earn very much. Anything they do earn, they tend to hoard and not spend, or kind of conserving what little resources they have. But they're sort of just rejecting the entire world of economics and finance out of fear of being incompetent. They're afraid if they engage with their financial life, it's going to prove that they can't do it. So they just push money away and say, well, money doesn't matter. And that tends to lead to all kinds of financial problems down the road. More common in the 5 is I call them the miser. And the miser is sort of the classic Ebenezer Scrooge. They're highly anxious around money, and they really using that to money to assuage their fear of incompetency, to make them get security. They feel like money is going to be this great safety blanket. In many ways it is. So having a robust financial life does provide a certain level of material security, but it often comes, for the miser, it comes at the cost of their relationships. They tend to be great savers. They tend to be poor givers. So going back to our four pillars of finance of earning, saving, investing, and giving, giving is often a problem for all 5s, but especially for the miser. Now, moving into type 6, the skeptic, I call them the family sedan of cars, of ego consciousness. They want safety and security above all else. But when they're money avoidant, they become paralyzed. They don't know what to do. They get overwhelmed very easily. They're looking for some support or guidance or someone else to help them make difficult decisions. But they're sort of overwhelmed by so much information and all the choices in front of them that they're caught like a deer in the headlights, and they just don't know which way to turn. And so they just get stuck in indecision, and their financial life never seems to go anywhere, at least in whatever area, whether it's earning, saving, investing, giving, where that happens to show up for the 6. And then now on the flip side, for the money anxious 6, I call them the puppet or the pugilist. So 6s have this weird dual nature where they're extremely skeptical of others. They don't trust easily. When they do trust, they become very, very loyal. But decision-making is hard for a 6. So when they do make a decision, they tend to stick with it. They tend to be very loyal to those decisions. And they can be that loyalty can make them into a bit of a puppet, whether to an employer or to whatever plan and track of life they're on, that they can have a very solid, if uninspiring financial life, but they tend to be puppets to pundits, to whatever the news cycle is telling them today, whatever crazy nonsense is happening on cable news. They're going to be like, okay, the market's up, I need to do something. The market's down, I need to do something. They're always, but they're kind of dancing to somebody else's strings rather than having a really grounded center and knowing, who they are and what they should be doing for themselves, independent of what is happening around them. But then on the flip side, if things go a little off track in their financial life, the money anxious 6 can become the pugilist. Which a pugilist is an old-fashioned term for a boxer or a fighter. So it's a bit of alliteration, if you'll pardon me that antiquated term. But they'll lash out in anger. when their budget gets, a little something that might trip up their budget, or there's an unexpected expense, or their spouse or partner spends in a way that they're not happy with, or something goes wrong at work, they're going to lash out and become like a fierce fighter for themselves and to get that sense of security that they feel is being trampled on by whatever external circumstances. So that's the 6, the skeptic, and then we're going to move to the 7, the enthusiast, or I call them the SUVs of egos. 7s have this externalized fear that the world isn't going to provide. They're afraid of being in pain or privation, and that the external world isn't going to meet their needs. So they're always kind of anxious about what comes next. They're always reaching for more. They tend to have a real problem with gluttony, or not necessarily just for food, but for experiences, for opportunities. And they're always living in a state of FOMO, fear of missing out. And so when we apply that to the money monsters, we've got the money avoidant 7 is going to call them the Gorgger. They're sort of like always grabbing more, and then when they do have money, it tends to go out right away. Their financial bucket is like got a hole in the bottom, and they're always leaking out whatever money comes in, and immediately goes out to a new vacation, a new car, a new experience, going out to a restaurant. They're just gorging on experiences. And so what that means is that their financial life can be a real mess. They're a bit like the prodigal son, if you know that story, that biblical reference, who kind of becomes a bit of a wastrel. They just spend their money on that's essentially the gorger in a nutshell. Pretty self-explanatory. And then we've got on the flip side, if they're money anxious, we've got the grabber, meaning they're grabbing more resources, they're grabbing more money, they're always sort of hoarding in a way that they're afraid that they're not going to have enough, that without enough money, without enough, it's going to limit their ability to have opportunities and experiences, so they just can't get enough of it, and then they're grabbing and grabbing and grabbing and grabbing out of a sort of a gluttonous desire to have more and more money, and that can create all kinds of problems for them down the road. So that's a quick overview of the money monsters for each of the 9 types, and then in the next video we'll talk about the money masters for each of them. So if you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe, and check out my new book, Taming Your Money Monsters, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. Comes out July 8th, and you can pre-order on Amazon. Thank you so much. Talk to you next time.